Well, I grew up in a house that was, in a household that was permeated by and marinated in politics and social issues and journalism, as well as some fiction and theater as well. But my parents, especially my father, were very political people, very involved in the anti-war movement, Gene McCarthy, the McGovern campaign, civil rights, all of those sorts of issues. And the New York Times was read religiously in our house. And I think my first awareness of journalism was when the big newspaper strike hit in New York in, I think, 63 or 64. And all of a sudden, this object of veneration stopped coming onto our doorstep every morning. And it was the absence of it and probably the consternation it caused my parents that led me to then, when it resumed after the strike was settled, start reading the Times. My father was someone who purely read for information. My mother, though, was a real pleasure reader and read voraciously and was always reading at least one book, frequently several, and had really wide-ranging taste, all kinds of things, everything, I don't know, John Gardner, John Hersey, Ann Tyler, early Ann Tyler, huge, and Roy, a huge array of work. So I was around a lot of it. And also, and I think this ended up mattering a lot to me, my parents were very ardent theater goers also. And I started going to the theater at age 5. I still remember the first play was called The Zulu and the Zeta. And that mattered a lot because one of the really important experiences for me years later in terms of becoming a writer was a period of about 3 years I spent in the early 80s covering theater for the New York Times, not reviewing it, but writing about it as a business and also as an art form in terms of doing features on the playwrights and directors in particular. And I got to see about 100 plays in a 3-year period without spending a dime. And I also got to interview a lot of writers. And that did two really important things. One is that it took the idea of writing off the pedestal for me, in the sense that I had really felt that to be a writer, especially a playwright or a novelist, you had to be sort of divinely kissed in order to do that, and that the act of writing was pure inspiration, and some people had it and some didn't. And when I got to talk to these writers, and on the one hand, you'd be talking to someone, you could see them channeling a character. I'd be talking to August Wilson about a play, and he would become one of the characters. At the same time, all these writers talked so much about the craft and the rewriting, and if they had good directors, how closely the editors worked. The directors worked in a kind of an editorial way. And the other thing that mattered in the long run, so that made it very approachable, made it seem accessible to me to be a writer. And the other thing was the architecture of plays. And if you go to see 100 plays in 3 years and you're seeing, Lanford Wilson and, Wendy Wasserstein, Marcia Norman, August Wilson, Sam Shepard, all kinds of classics, revivals of O'Neill and Miller, interesting young writers like Keith Radine. You get an incredible education in pacing and in the uses of dialogue and in the importance of setting a scene and in how to manage exposition. And I'm constantly referring back to plays, both inside my own head when I'm writing nonfiction, but also when I'm teaching it a lot. I probably draw as many lessons for my students out of drama as I do out of fiction or nonfiction books. In any case, to go back, but journalism at a young age was what felt obtainable to me, so I did the classic junior high school newspaper, college newspaper, then going on to a series of newspapers from small in suburban New Jersey to mid-sized in the suburbs of Chicago, to then the New York Times, and then a few different beats on the Times, first in the suburbs, then the culture section, then doing urban issues, and then finally went on to my first book, which was about an inner city teacher, and her students were mostly immigrants. And along the way, I'd gone through, I think, two kind of important phases as a reader, because a lot of, again, what develops you as a writer is to read. And in high school, because I was so interested in journalism, I read largely nonfiction. I didn't read all that much fiction for pleasure. In college, and especially as I got out of college onto my first newspaper job, I radically changed that, and for whatever reason, I became almost entirely a reader of fiction, and in particular, a reader of fiction from other parts of the world. I was really affected by writers like Carlos Fuentes, by Aya Kwai Armah, who is a Nigerian writer, by the South African writers, of whom my favorite was Andre Brink, but also Gordimer and Coetzee. And I think because these were novelists who had a big social vision, so they were the kind of novelists who had the power of invention, but also really spoke to you if you had an interest in social and political issues, economic inequality, race relations, things like that. And then an editor of mine on this mid-sized paper in the suburbs of Chicago, who'd wanted to be a comp lit professor before she ended up in the newspaper racket, had said to me, because we talk about literature a lot, and she said, there are nonfiction books that are as amazing as novels. And I said, in that sort of arrogant 23-year-old know-it-all way, well, tell me about one. And she said, well, have you ever heard of a book called The Power Broker? And at her behest, I read The Power Broker, and that just exploded my brain, because then I saw nonfiction that had kind of this gigantic Dickensian, social realist novels canvas, but it was all true. And that sort of opened up a whole line of dissent for me that led to, probably most importantly for me, J. Anthony Lucas, and Halberstam as well. But I'd say for me, the single most influential was Tony Lucas. So I think getting both the fiction part nourished and the nonfiction part all fed into it. And then, over time, other favorites became writers who, to me, sort of worked both sides of the street. Richard Price, Russell Banks, Bill Kennedy's Albany novels, and also O Albany. People who seemed to be able to do both things, or to write either fiction that was informed by a kind of social vision that I associated with journalists, as well as journalists who had this grand storytelling ability that I associated with novelists.